Hello and welcome to the Career Speakeasy, a casual, fun, and irreverent place to share ideas about career development, the world of work, and life in general. I'm your host and proprietress, Kelly Nottingham. Growing your career should not be boring. So come on in, pull up a chair, and pick your poison. Hello, wonderful listeners. Many years ago, my boss at the time was scheduled to speak at a local nursing conference meeting. Now, 2 days before her session, she called me, barely able to croak out that she had a bad case of laryngitis, and she needed to ask a favor of me. She obviously would not be able to do her presentation because she could not get any sound to come out of her mouth. So she called to ask if I'd be willing to cover for her. She had the presentation written and ready to go, so she emailed it to me and we went through it over the phone so that I was clear on what needed to be said and what the presentation was all about. Now, it was a topic that wasn't overly familiar to me at the time. This was a while back, at least 13 years ago, and the topic was cultural awareness in healthcare settings. So this was, becoming a really important and honestly challenging topic to facilitate at that time. So we discussed the presentation and she croaked out a big thank you, told me where to show up and when to show up, and said that she would put me in touch with the organizers so they could get in touch with me directly. Now, by this point in my career, I had been doing training and development for years, and I was used to presenting to groups in my workplace, groups ranging in size from, a handful of people all the way up to a fairly good-sized auditorium full of maybe 100 to 150 people. So I wasn't particularly nervous about the overall idea of public speaking, but I will say there was a little bit of nervousness because this was a new venue, a new audience, and a new topic, but I kind of felt like I could handle it. Now, on the morning of the event, I got dressed and I drove to the location of the event, this meeting. And I guess in my mind, I had been thinking that this was just like a small chapter meeting for some local nurses in the city that I was living in Georgia. But when I got there, I quickly realized that it was actually a state conference with people who had come from all over Georgia and beyond to listen to these presentations. So it was way bigger profile than I had expected. And I remember very vividly having this surreal moment of just complete and utter out-of-body panic when the person who was introducing me got up and started reading my bio out loud to this big group of people. I had never done any kind of event like this before. And I remember thinking, what am I doing here? I don't even know what I'm talking about. I don't really know this presentation that well. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, even though I had years of speaking experience under my belt, this new situation threw me off. Fortunately, because of my previous experience, I was able to deal with the fear and anxiety and that out-of-body numbness that comes with sort of the shock and panic of dealing with something new. And I was able to get myself back together. I took a deep breath. I smiled at the audience as I walked up to the podium, jumped in with my first intro sentence, and then asked them to pair up with their neighbor and answer a question. And while they chatted for a minute, I took several more deep breaths and then proceeded with the presentation. Now, it ended up being a great success, enough of one that they actually invited me to do the same presentation at their national conference, which was yet another whole new experience and intimidation being in a ballroom with 500 people, but it turned out to be super fun. So the reason I'm telling this story is twofold. First, it's not unusual at all, even if you have experience speaking in public, to still have moments of nerves, especially when the situation is new or different somehow. The fear of public speaking is called glossophobia, and I love that the literal translation of that word means tongue dread. That just cracks me up. Fear of public speaking affects over 25% of the population, according to some estimates, and that's the serious phobia side. That's not even counting the people who just get really nervous. So if this is you, please know that you're not alone. The second reason that I share the story is also to let you know that fear of public speaking is something that can be managed and potentially even overcome. I think a lot of people shut themselves off from the possibility of ever being able to do public speaking. And so they hold themselves back from expressing opinions at work, either online or in person, from giving a toast at a friend's wedding, or from sharing ideas at a social gathering, or inspiring listeners at a charity fundraiser to try to raise money for a good cause, whatever the case may be. That fear of public speaking can keep you feeling small, it can keep you quiet, and it can literally and figuratively steal your voice and ideas from the world. So today, we are going to be talking about 4 practical approaches you can do to help conquer your fear of public speaking. Number 1, know your purpose and keep it in mind. Now, whether you've been asked to say a few words at your niece's bat mitzvah, or you're going into a work meeting where you know you're going to need to speak up for yourself, it's critical to know your purpose, why you're saying something in the first place. Now, your purpose could be to educate, it could be to influence, it could be to point out a problem, or maybe to show support to someone else. Whatever your purpose might be, that purpose becomes your mission while you speak. No matter if you're only saying 10 words or whether you're doing a 2-hour-long speech, your purpose is the foundation of what you're trying to get across. So before you start to open your mouth, think through, what is your purpose? What do you want to accomplish with the words that you're getting ready to speak? And if you aren't sure that you have a purpose with what you're getting ready to say, maybe it's not the time to say anything. So for example, let's say that you've been asked to lead your next team meeting because your leader will be out of town. Your purpose is to share information with the team, to make sure that they understand that information, and to collect questions from the team to give back to your leader after the meeting. You know what your purpose isn't? To be the center of attention, to be perfect, to perform, to dominate the conversation, and to keep yourself on track during the meeting. To keep that purpose in your mind, you can write your purpose at the top of your copy of the agenda. Share info, check for understanding, gather questions. Doesn't that suddenly feel better? Doesn't that take some of the pressure to be perfect or to perform off of the situation? Ah, yes, the power of purpose. If you're doing a more formal speech, your purpose can be to educate on these 3 key points, and you keep those 3 key points in mind and at the top of your speaker notes. See, it's pretty straightforward, but it is something that's very easily overlooked. So knowing your purpose or your big why leads directly to our next tip. Number 2, focus on your audience. I remember hearing some public speaking advice a long time ago. Imagine your audience naked, or in their underwear if you want to keep it PG-13. So personally, this doesn't work for me. I'm not saying it won't work for you, but here's my philosophy on it. I don't need to mentally humiliate my audience to make myself feel better while speaking. When you deal with a fear of public speaking, it's easy to see your audience as this massive group of numbers or titles, or there are all these people, this mass of humanity listening to me, and to let that intimidate you. They're focused on you, they're watching you, they're listening to you, and you begin to see yourself as, frankly, more important than you likely are. You put yourself on a sort of pedestal of importance. Now, before you feel insulted, let me explain. First of all, you as the person speaking, you are not the star. The audience is the star. They are at the center of your purpose, right? Therefore, this whole situation, it's not about you. It's about the audience. It's about whether or not they are understanding the message that you're trying to get across. So this can take off a lot of pressure. It helps you to feel like you don't have to be perfect because you're walking into the situation knowing that your attention is focused on the audience, not as a large group of people or a room full of important titles, but as human beings. The goal becomes making sure that they're getting whatever it is that you're trying to get to them. It's not about being perfect on stage or doing some kind of earth-shatteringly awesome speech. And here's the secret. When you take the focus off of yourself and your performance and turn your focus onto the audience and making sure that they're understanding what you're saying, they will appreciate you and what you're saying even more. As Maya Angelou said, quote, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." End quote. Now, another part of focusing on your audience is realizing that everybody is rooting for you to be successful. Rarely, very, very rarely, are you ever walking into a situation where you're getting ready to speak up about something and the other people in the room are hoping that you trip over your own feet or that you fumble your words or that you panic and you just sit back down. Nobody wants to see that. And frankly, if they do, that's their own internal issue and has nothing to do with you. So know that the people listening to you are rooting for you to be successful. Now, if you don't feel it, look around the room for a kind face and take that kindness to heart. If you get a chance to mill around for a few minutes before you speak, do it. When you spend that last few minutes trying to cram what you want to say into your head, you're really not helping yourself or the audience. But humanizing the audience by saying hello to them is going to help a ton. Then you can keep an eye out for those friendly faces as you speak. Now, yes, you're probably going to see some faces looking at you who are angry or people who are distracted or look annoyed, people who just aren't paying attention. Hopefully they're in the minority. Now, if they're just a couple of those people in the audience, don't worry about them. Keep your focus on your purpose and getting that purpose across to the rest of the people in your audience. Because frankly, who knows why that person's grumpy? They may have had all kinds of other stuff going on that has nothing to do with you, and it's not your job to fix it for them. Now, one trick I used to use early in my career is to look for the grumpy person at the beginning of the session, or if possible, before my speech even starts. And if I'm going to be facilitating a really contentious team meeting, I sometimes will still do this. I glance around the room and pick out the person that I think is going to be the grump. And as I look around the room while I'm speaking, I can use that as a little bit of a game with myself. Like, is that person looking grumpy now? If so, then yay, I guessed right. Well, if they're not looking grumpy, then great. They're enjoying the session. So it's a win-win either way. And it can help alleviate some stress over seeing those occasional bored or unhappy people. Number 3, practice, practice, practice. Practice saying your thoughts out loud. Practice saying what you want to say in front of your dog or a willing friend. Practice using your technology while you talk. Practice talking while using your notes. Practice your presentation out loud and say the words out loud. I know that it will feel silly, and when you're giving your wedding speech to your dog, you're going to feel ridiculous. But actually saying the words out loud will help you to catch where something maybe doesn't make sense, or you have a hard time enunciating a couple of words in succession with each other. Maybe you want to change the wording on those. Practicing out loud helps you realize where you may be getting off on a tangent. It will help you figure out maybe where you need to repeat your key points again, and then you add those spots back into your notes. It's especially important to practice telling your stories or anecdotes if you're using any, because you want your stories to feel conversational. So practice telling the stories out loud until you feel comfortable with them. And if you have a friend who's willing to be your practice audience, use that opportunity. It's so beneficial to your practice to have a face to look at. If you're using any technology, slides, a clicker, a microphone, virtual presentation software, practice with that too. Get a friend to log on to the virtual presentation software if possible and practice that way. Now, I strongly recommend having notes, even if you're doing something quick. Let's say you're just jumping in to share a point of view in a meeting. Even then, it's helpful to have just a couple of quick words written down in front of you so that you can remind yourself of what you're trying to get across, your purpose. In a longer type of public speaking environment, let's say that you're, again, doing a speech at some kind of event, notes are still going to be extremely helpful for you. And this is where the idea of practicing your presentation with your notes is going to come in super handy. Because you'll find the more public speaking you do, the easier it gets. And the more easily you're going to be able to understand what kind of notes you really need for your best presentation. Now, there are some people who love to use outlines. Some people will work very happily off of having a broad outline and they know, this is roughly what I'm going to say and they can just improvise from there. Whenever I'm doing a presentation for the first time, I actually normally like to have a fairly decently written script typed out. And I'll highlight throughout the script the keywords that I want to make sure that I bring up. And those keywords are memory cues so that I can see the word or the highlighted phrase when I glance down to my notes. And I know that I need to make sure that I'm not skipping over that. As I do the presentation or the speech multiple times, I find that I'm often able to simplify my notes down to an outline form. Or even honestly, just a few key phrases so that it's easier for me to just quickly skim and know what I need to say. The challenge with having a full script written out is that it's very easy to fall into reading mode instead of actually talking to your audience. Reading your presentation or your speech is a really easy way to lose your audience quickly. So, okay, you have notes, but it's not enough just to have notes. You need to practice with your notes. As you go through what you're going to say, you can make extra notes on your notes if you tend to go blank in one spot or you forget to include something or if you need to mention that people should look at their handouts or whatever. I also like to set a timer when I'm practicing my presentations or speeches and jot down the time in my notes. Now, this is especially important if you're doing something where you have a limited time frame. A lot of times at conferences, you may not know this, but you'll actually have somebody sitting in the front row who has these little flashcards that they'll hold up that say, you have 15 minutes left, you have 5 minutes left, and you're out of time. So that way you know as a speaker without looking at your watch or your phone that your time is winding down. But if you have a 50-minute time slot, you don't want to get 45 minutes in and realize you've only gotten through a quarter of the content that you wanted to cover. So this has been a trick I've used for many years. It's actually writing down the time where I should be when I get to that page in my notes. So for example, 10 minutes in or 15 minutes left, and I'll write that at the top of my notes in a different color and usually circle it so I can glance up at the clock or make sure that I'm still running along the timeline that I need to. This is also a good way to psych yourself up because when you see the 5 minutes left in your notes, you know you're almost done. Now, one last thought about notes before moving into our last section. The vast majority of the time, we'll have the ability to have our notes with us while we speak, unless you're maybe doing like a TED Talk, right? If you aren't used to practicing with your notes while speaking, you might not realize how clumsy you'll feel when you're nervous or how easy it can be to get onto the wrong page. And this is honestly why I always recommend that you do not use a handful of index cards for your speech or presentation. It's just way too easy to drop them or end up shuffling them out of order. And the last thing you need is something else to worry about. Paper works great. If you'll be near a podium, you can put your notes in a pretty binder or a folder, or for my Australian friends, a lever arch file. Okay, now on to our final tip for this episode, and it is a big one. Number 4, identify what scares you and plan for it. Naming your fear very specifically and planning for it is so important to help manage your anxiety. But even if you aren't feeling super nervous, deciding on your plan B is always a smart idea. Sometimes I even have a plan C too. And honestly, I've had to resort to that plan C before when things just completely did not go as expected. So what are some common fears? One of the big ones is going blank. We've talked about having your notes already. So this will help a lot with that fear of just standing up in front of a group and going completely blank. Another technique I mentioned in the beginning of this episode is something I did at that nursing conference. If you're nervous that you're going to go up on stage or you're going to get in front of your audience and you're really concerned that you're just going to completely freeze and not remember anything that you're supposed to say, memorize the first sentence or two of your presentation and have your notes available with those first couple of lines written out so you have them there to fall back on. Once you get through those, if you're still feeling terrified, have a question that you can ask the audience, like a reflection question. If you're in an in-person setting, you can always actually have them turn to each other and answer the question with the person sitting next to them. If you're online, you can ask them to think about a time when, or you can ask them to write their answer in the chat. This was a technique that I used for a while to help me with those initial nerves until I got past this point in my public speaking fear. I would get up, I would introduce the topic, and then I would ask them a question. And then I would let them talk for a couple of minutes to each other. Once they started talking to each other, the pressure was off of me for a minute. So I could breathe a little bit. I could recollect myself and say, okay, I got through this first little bit. This is going to be fine. Take a few deep breaths, relax, and then you jump back in with the rest of the presentation. It's kind of like planning to improvise, if you will. If you don't need the question at that point, that's fine. You can use it later on in your speech, or you can just not use it at all. But it's good to have a couple of those broad questions in your back pocket. So what's another common fear? How about technology not working? Yeah, this happens to everybody. People tend to be pretty forgiving of technology not working, especially nowadays that we're so dependent on it and it becomes so common to see people struggle with technology issues. Where people get impatient or irritated is when the tech issue completely derails the entire presentation or speech. Now, if you're in a virtual environment, there may not be a ton you can do to fix this, but learning how to handle tech issues, maybe even having some troubleshooting notes with you, and again, practicing with your technology to see what could go wrong and how to fix it, that will help. The other way to work with this one is deciding how you're going to deal with a technology issue well before the issue actually comes up. So once upon a time, many years ago, I taught a multiple-day new hire orientation training in a big conference-style room, usually with 50 to 75 new employees every couple of weeks. This room had a fancy audio-visual setup with installed projectors on the ceiling and built-in speakers. Great. Except when the bulbs would burn out. We had to actually get a technician from the projector company to come in and replace the bulbs. So one Monday morning, I walk in to teach orientation with all of these people in the room. I turn on the projector and realize, oh, it was already turned on and had been on all weekend. Thank you, person who did not turn off the projector on Friday. So while the projector was on for those days, the bulb burned out. So we had already thankfully provided attendees with a copy of the slides and their participant book. So we just had to do things the old school way with no projector that week. I added in a few more activities and more questions to get people talking to each other just to keep it from getting too dry. But we ended up having a great session without the projector. Those slides, those were the plan B. And sometimes that turns into our plan that we got to use right now. So prepare in advance for your plan B. Another big fear that comes up with public speaking is the fear of fear itself. This is the biggest piece of glossophobia for many people. It's the anxiety about the anxiety. Anyone who's ever dealt with panic attacks and the anticipatory anxiety that comes with having panic attacks knows exactly what I'm talking about. So how do you plan for the fear itself? Now, this is a massive topic with lots of different directions that we could go. So this little section is going to be just a super quick overview, but hopefully it will help some of you. The nervous energy you're feeling is partly because you care. You want to do a good job, and that's great. Your fear is trying to help you by protecting you from failure and from risk. But public speaking is really not as risky as, being chased by a prehistoric jaguar. But our fear brains, those primitive parts of our brains, don't understand the difference. Our minds just run rampant in a fear situation. We've talked about the fight, flight, freeze response before, but just as a quick reminder, our brains during a fear situation move into a state of dealing with immediate danger. And it has a hard time refocusing on longer term stuff or on the fact that we're not being chased by a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger or something. So one trick that can help us out here is to write some reassuring things in your notes to help calm your brain. Now, you want to obviously put these in a spot in your notes where you're not going to say them out loud. You can put them in a different color if you need to. But you can say things like, write things down like, I will survive this. Or one of my favorites, this will be over in 45 minutes and I can move on with my life. If you're worried about the pre-speech brain dump, what we talked about a few minutes ago, where you literally just can't remember anything, including your own name or what you wanted to say, this is where you can go back to your notes then. Now, while our minds are going overboard, our bodies are also responding to the fear by doing all kinds of exciting things like nausea, or feeling lightheaded or dizzy, or heart palpitations, or muscle cramps, or tightening in our muscles, or sweating, or hyperventilating, dry mouth, shakiness, jaw tension. So first of all, know how your body tends to respond in anxiety situations and plan for it as much as you can. If you tend to get a very dry mouth, you can take some mouth moistening spray with you. Did you know that exists? It does. If your stomach tends to get upset, take some medicine, take some ginger lozenges with you so you're ready for an emergency. And this needs to be said, alcohol or other, let's call it recreational chemistry, those things are not going to make the situation better. They might make you feel like you're doing better, but trust me on this one, you need to be in control of the situation. Don't give your control away. Focus on breathing deeply, not into the upper part of your lungs, but slowly and deeply down into your belly, as deep as you can. Breathe slowly and feel where you're holding tension in your body. To loosen up that tension, you can do some simple stretches and tightening, loosening exercises. So for example, if you hold tension in your hands, so you're either making involuntary fists or you tend to white knuckle gripping the podium or the microphone or your notes, stretch your fingers out as far apart as you comfortably can. Then make a super tight fist and hold it for a few seconds and then stretch them back out again. If you feel your legs getting tight or your neck, you can do the same thing. Tighten, hold, relax. Tighten, hold, relax. You can even remind yourself to do this during your speech by writing little emojis or drawings or notes like breathe or smile or relax or hands or you're almost done. Before you know it, you've said what you wanted to say, you can sit down and relax, and you can know that your comfort zone has gotten just a little bit bigger. So the next time you need to speak up, hopefully it will be a little bit easier. All right, it's time for last call. In this episode, we discussed 4 different approaches for conquering a fear of public speaking. Number 1, know your purpose and keep it in mind. Number 2, focus on your audience. Number 3, practice, practice, practice. And number 4, identify what scares you and plan for it. Now, if you deal with a fear of public speaking, I want you to find a low-risk opportunity in the next week to speak up in front of other people. Maybe it's sharing an idea in a meeting. Maybe it's offering to present at a meeting. Whatever it is, take a step out there, because here is a key truth. Experience expands your comfort zone. Sitting there trying to plan so everything is perfect, overthinking about it, worrying about it, those things don't actually expand our comfort zones. They're just giving us an illusion of doing something productive. But there comes a point when the best way to build our skill is to do the thing. So find an opportunity to do the thing this week. Thanks for listening, everybody. Talk to you soon. If the pandemic lockdown has made you aware of some major changes you want to make in your career or life, I can help. Maybe you realize you hate your current job, or that you're holding yourself back from making a big life change that deep down you really want. Now is the time to start building momentum for the future. I've spent my career in professional development and training at Fortune 100 companies, leading training initiatives and coaching people from frontline employees to executive-level leaders to improve their relationship to their work, their colleagues, and themselves. If you think some non-judgmental support and gentle nudging would help to get you going, give me a call to discuss one-on-one coaching and consulting. If your organization or company is ready for an injection of new ideas, energy, and practical tools to improve company culture and efficiency, let's chat. I have off-the-shelf workshops ready to bring to your organization on topics like effective communication, change management, presentation skills, and a suite of leadership development workshops, just to name a few. Custom workshops are also an option. For a 30-minute complimentary consultation, email me at kelly.nottingham@gmail.com, go to kellynottingham.com, or reach out to me on LinkedIn or via the links in the podcast notes so we can see if I'm a good fit for your needs. Well, thanks for joining me. If you have suggestions, feedback, or just something random you want to share, email me at careerspeakeasy@gmail.com. And come visit again soon. Cheers!